Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country and around the world, happy winter, happy Olympics, happy bizarre times continuing. In many ways, it feels like 1985 all over again. The Olympics are happening. There is a new Cold War. We are at odds with Russia. Things continue to be nuts, and I could think of no better person to bring us to this conversation, specifically around Russia, Ukraine, and all other things, than a returning champion, a friend of the show, the great and powerful Molly McKew is back on Independent Americans. Welcome back, my friend.
Thank you for having me back. Glad to be here.
Um, I always ask, you've been on twice before. It was May 2021 and November 2020. At that time, last time you were on, there were massive cyber attacks in the U.S.
Yeah.
You are always one of our most interesting and entertaining and informative guests. You are an international woman of mystery. So in building off of that, I've got to ask you, where are you and how are you?
Alas, I am still in Washington, although I have actually traveled since the beginning of the pandemic now, which is like a miracle. But I wish I was further to the east just now. Let's just say that. I'm okay. I'm teaching again this semester, so I'm just like, you always forget how much time that takes and how you want to engage all of these great young smart students and make them into better proto-humans, but like it takes a lot of time. I'm good. I've got a lot going on. And of course, like anyone who does what I do, we're all trying to do stuff around Ukraine. So it's complicated, but I'm okay. I just got a lot going on.
Well, I appreciate you breaking that to spend time with us again. And it is complicated. And that's why I wanted to talk to you. So, we have this backdrop of the Olympics. We have Putin sitting in the stands. We've got a lot of chatter of all kinds. I wore my USA BMX shirt. You asked me when we
I
what
was
is
wondering,
that shirt?
like, what are the wings on your shirt?
Since we're going to talk about Russia here, I grew up in the 80s, which like it sparks all these images of Red Dawn and Ivan Drago and all these images of being in the Wolverines and fighting the Russians.
But you watched Red Dawn. How old were you roughly when you watched Red Dawn? Do you remember? Like young enough that it was like
probably
a
like
formative,
11. Probably like
so
11.
it was like a formative thing for you, right? Like, yeah.
I mean, I am the generation
and you had the
that
plan,
wanted,
right? Like you had a Red Dawn plan.
I was the generation that was going to join Jed in the mountains and be in the Wolverines. Absolutely, yeah.
100%. Me too.
Yeah.
And so when one of my good Ukrainian friends, who was a revolutionary and an organizer of fighting and all sorts of interesting things, when he first came to the States, I made him stay with me so I could do like the full indoctrination tour of Washington. And one night I made him watch Red Dawn, and he was like, "Why are we watching this movie? I don't want to watch this." I was like, "You're gonna watch this movie." And he gets like really quiet and he watches the movie, and at the end he turns to me and he goes, "This movie is brilliant propaganda. You all had a plan, didn't you?" I was like, "We absolutely all had a plan." And he was like convinced that they needed to have this for Ukraine. But the mindset of resistance is back into cool in military parlance these days. So hey, Red Dawn is hip again.
Yes, and maybe what we may end up having to see in the Ukraine, and I hope you can correct me on that because I know there's a lot of differences around that. It may look like Red Dawn in 2022 style in the next couple of months if Russia does invade. And the resistance, I think, will be ferocious and dynamic. You have many contacts in Ukraine. I have many friends who are there, who have served there. We know a bit about that. But what I want to start by asking you, Molly, is what are we not seeing? You are an expert on misinformation, on cybersecurity and attacks. There's a talk about, will Russia invade Ukraine with 100,000 troops on the border? What's already happening? Because I feel like, and what I've read and seen is that cyber attacks and other disruptive things are already happening, and maybe have been happening for some time. So can you start with that? What's already happening that most people aren't seeing?
Yeah, I'm gonna answer this in three parts. One is the stuff we don't see, gray zone, blah blah blah. Second will be but the war has already been 8 years, and third will be the stuff that's actually about us. And I think that first category, which is everywhere, kind of persistent Russian cyber activity, either embedding in systems, preparing to embed in systems, creating backdoors, cultivating pathways. I think Ukraine has been very much already a testing ground for a lot of the newer sort of how do we get in? Can we shut down whole power grids? What will that look like? What will the effects be? How fast can people respond? I think it is inevitable that if there is some sort of larger attack on Ukraine, a component of it will be something cyber to disrupt how the government commands and controls its own structures, to disrupt the public, to create panic. If you can shut down banking, people freak out, things like that. The same kind of things they did in Estonia in 2007, they tried to do in Georgia in 2008, less successfully. It wasn't as much of a factor, but it definitely created the, oh my God, what's going on sense. And then ongoing in Ukraine from 2014, there's been power grid attacks, water system attacks. And I think an aspect of that we don't see as much here, there's been a little coverage of it in English, but not as much, is like, what is it like to be a Ukrainian right now? And I'm actually going to put up a piece on my thing, greatpower.us, in the next couple of days, written by my Ukrainian researcher who's worked with me for a long time now, about this aspect. Like, what is it like to be a Ukrainian right now? And the stuff we don't see, which is for months, there's been persistent bomb threats at schools, hospitals, public locations, malls, government buildings, to the point where schools have basically just like shut down and sent everyone home because there's just no time for everybody to respond to all these threats. But just this, like, it's mostly meant to distract resources, keep the police busy, but it just exhausts society, right? You live under this constant what the fuck is going on sense. So stuff like that has been happening. There have been smaller cyber related disruptions, nothing huge, but just little things. And I think in general, the information environment has been so polluted by this ridiculous fear mongering. Oh my God, if the war comes, 50,000 people will die in Kyiv in the first 2 minutes. It's like, come on, people, we're smarter than this. Like, we're smarter than giving the Russians this much for free. And yet that's what we're doing. So I think living in that environment as a Ukrainian is extremely hard. And I think we're not understanding that enough, because we tend to talk about Ukraine as like a tiddlywink on a board and not as a country with 44 million people in it, right? So I think that what it is like to be a Ukrainian right now is something I think we should pay more attention to, and understand how many people have enlisted either in reserves or in active duty service, prepared, trained in some aspect, if not for the army and other reserves and like the medical reserves and other things. This is a society that has been in a state of perpetual war for 8 years. And I think to some extent, this is why there's been this kind of chill, yeah, guys, it's not different than it was yesterday vibe from the Ukrainians that's really like freaking out a lot of people in the West. Like, why aren't they more panicked? Like, we're panicked. And they're like, because we've been doing this every day for 8 years. And so it's really interesting, the like weird communication between us right now. But I think understanding better that this already looks pretty terrible if you're in Ukraine, but is just sort of how you've been living all these years now, is something we should understand, because it's why we should actually care more about resolving the situation when Russia isn't trying to blackmail us all the time. So I think there's that aspect, which is important. I think the other piece is just the war is always there. It's always there. They've been doing this a long time. 14,000 Ukrainians have died. And we forget about that conveniently when we decide to not pay attention to it. And we shouldn't, because that's our war. Like, they are fighting for us. They are fighting because Russia keeps trying to move the line where we will mentally respond to their bullshit westward. And right now it's pretty far to the west in terms of like where we're talking about where we would actually mobilize, right? And they know that. I don't think Ware is aware of that. But for Ukraine right now, what you want is like they're not asking us to be there, despite the dumb discussions that happen on U.S. news. They're not asking American troops to come fight side by side with them. They're fighting this war. They just want us to not drop the Iron Curtain behind them, instead of giving them the chance to be in what we are. And then I think just the last point, and I know this is long, sorry, is we're talking about this as a war on Ukraine, and it is in terms of the kinetic war. But so much of it is already beyond Ukraine, and very much all of it is about the White House and President Biden, and what the Kremlin thinks they can get out of them. And I think they're somewhat aware of that, but need to be vastly more aware of it. And just the level of Russian mobilization, which is not just about Ukraine. And frankly, the stuff around Ukraine is not enough to like besiege Ukraine and take it territorially from top to bottom. But the mobilization in the Black Sea, the mobilization in the Baltic Sea, all the crap they're doing in Africa right now. They were trying to hold naval exercises off the coast of Ireland. Like, they're all over the place doing all sorts of things to see what our reactions will be. And they have not been.
So I'm glad that answer was long, because this is the beauty of no, really, this is the beauty of a podcast where I can give you time to expand on an idea in a way you can on cable news and other places. And I really think that framework setting is key here, because I've been trying to elevate a number of national security priorities.
Absolutely.
And we've got Ukraine, we've got Taiwan, and we've got things like the Arctic, which are completely off people's radar, right? So there is a scenario that feels like it's from, the Stavridis novel, The Doomsday Scenario, where we have multiple phases of a war against multiple types of enemies, while we are internally conflicted. And it's like Red Dawn on steroids, right? Like, I think in the old Red Dawn, the Russians linked up with the Cubans, and then the new Red Dawn, which was terrible, it was like a bastardization of Red Dawn in the same way.
We will never discuss it again. Yes.
Yeah, but it's a bastardization of Red Dawn the same way the new Mustang is a bastardization of a Ford Mustang. But they linked up with the North Koreans, right? So now you've got China and Russia in this new axis, and then you've got folks like North Korea that are still unpredictable. But then you've also got, this tug of war going on where Germany didn't exactly jump up and say, hey, we got your back, you can count on us. You've got folks like France and Macron trying to be intermediaries and be the peacemakers here. But I want to go back to what you really have a unique expertise on, the cyber component, right? And the technological component. I don't even know if I'm encompassing correctly. Yeah. Is this not, we used to worry about a nuke war, right? Like, what would a real nuke war look like? Is this going to be, if they do invade Ukraine, is this going to be a first real test of what they can do when they unleash all of the stuff in their technological arsenal? And is it a test of ours, right? Because the Ukrainians want our javelins and they want our equipment and they want us over in Germany. But is Cyber Command already funding the fight and fueling the fight and not telling us? I'm sure we have intelligence people there. I'm sure we have special operators under the radar that they will never claim. But is there not Cyber Command assets already helping them fight this invisible technological war?
On the cyber piece, I, of course, do not know at all about any of the secret stuff that is happening. But even publicly, there is a lot of expertise, support. The Balts that are particularly talented in these areas have had good relationships with Ukraine. I'm not sure if Estonia has sent one of its CERT teams, like their cyber preparedness and response groups in, but they have previously. So I'm assuming that capacity is kind of there. Certainly people on that side, on the non-kinetic war side, we and others have tried to make resources available to them. There was an attempt to give them official access to kind of the NATO scheme that shares information on this, which of course Hungary, which is just signed a new gas deal with Putin, blocked. But it doesn't really matter. Everybody is still doing what they can on that front. And honestly, the Ukrainians we've gotten so much information from the Ukrainians about what is happening, what's in their systems, what the Russians have done, where they are testing stuff, that information sharing is pretty good. But I think that there's more there than what we see, which doesn't mean you can stop it or save it or whatever, but hopefully it's there's quick visibility at the very least if there is some kind of an attack about what it is and what needs to happen and how to communicate that outside the country and inside the country.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I think what we really have
piece.
I think we have to redefine, especially for the mainstream civilian population, what war in 2022 looks like, right? Like I have argued the Russians didn't meddle in our elections; they attacked our elections. If I were framing
Absolutely.
this from an international policy standpoint, I would have said that was an act of war. Right now, is a cyber attack an act of war? I think it is, but not in our current legislative and nomenclature framework, at least within the media. So, this idea that it's a Cold War, I think that terminology and framework is even outdated because we've been at war with Russia in the cyberspace for decades now, right? Or as long as that's
Yep.
been a thing. And so when we talk about and we drill down on Ukraine, you mentioned there are ships in the Baltic, the Black Sea, they're meddling all around the place. No one wants to make a prediction here.
Right.
It's Super Bowl weekend. Is Putin going to do this? Is Putin going to send tank? Is he going to do this? And if he was going to do this, and you had to predict, I'm not going to only ask you to predict who's going to win the game, but I'm going to ask you to predict the spread. When is he going to do this? And if he does, when and why?
So I think the ultimate horizon that I would look at for right now, and obviously this is a dodge of an answer, but Putin turned 70 in October. It's his birthday, and kind of the chatter is that he wants something big before his birthday to show he's still a vital and vibrant young man, not full of Botox and evilness, right? And so I think the idea that something will happen in the summer, like between now and the fall, is it seems like a pretty safe bet. Like something stupid will happen in this timeline to remind us that Russia is a thing. But they're doing that right now, and I think there's so much talk about. I mean, yes, this mobilization is huge, right? Like so much Russian personnel, materiel, their battle technical groups have been mobilized and moved to the west. Some all the way from the Far East. Russia is 9 time zones, so that's not an insignificant movement. There's tons of stuff moving around, but to some extent, it just feels like you take a bunch of stuff and you throw it in a can and you're like shaking it around to like make people understand you're making a lot of noise. But that's mostly what they're doing. And that's not to say that there isn't stuff there that's actually ready for war. There is. There's fuel, there's blood supply, there's, field hospitals, there's dudes, there's reservists being mobilized, whatever. Like all of that stuff is there, but it still kind of has that, and we're just rattling the stuff around in the can vibe. You can't take Ukraine with 150,000 troops. Like that's not a thing that's going to happen. And maybe part of it, like maybe you just want to kill a lot of people. Maybe they do decide to go full Iraq 1991 air war shock and awe moment, right? But there's this line of, but why would you do that when it would actually evoke more of a response, right? That I'm just not sure. I'm not sure. I mean, everybody's still like, we're not sure if Putin's made the decision or not. I think looking back on 2008, which was when Russia invaded Georgia, which is not the same in the sense that Georgia is this big and Ukraine is a real thing, right? Like Georgia was 4 million people and Ukraine is 10 times bigger than that. But it was the same scenario in which Russia piled its entire freaking army on the border of Georgia. And the Jordans were like, hey guys, we should pay attention to this. And everybody's like, no, it's fine. Russia's not stupid enough to invade. Like Putin would never do that, And it there's a point at which there's just so much stuff there, it kind of tips itself into kinetic war, right? And I think we all worry about that, the sense of like, well, you've done this. What's a big enough thing that allows you to undo it without doing it, right? What is the thing? And I think to some extent, it then comes back to, but why are they doing this in the first place, right? And this is the part where it's kind of gross and icky to talk about, where it's like, in Georgia, what they wanted was the very pro-Western Georgian government to collapse. And they didn't achieve that in 2008. Georgia actually got a lot of support after the war financially so that its economy in particular did not collapse, both from Europe and the United States, which and this was right during the financial crisis, right? So Georgia actually kind of skated through that period when other people were in a worse state because they were getting outside support. The political war against Georgia then increased, and that continued on in 2012, which we can talk about some other time. But I think this is the thing we need to look at in Ukraine, is like, what is the objective of doing this? And I think the objective, and Putin has now been very clear about this after the Macron visit that you mentioned, What the Ukrainians keep telling us now is, hey, this Minsk Accord, the Minsk agreements that were sort of signed at gunpoint, in the beginning phases of the war, this notional, potential framework of a peace agreement, air quotes, between Ukraine and these pretend, occupied region governments or whatever. Russia's not even a party to this agreement, which is the kabuki they always play. It's not us fighting, it's these, nonsensical separatists. So the Minsk Accords, very much signed with a Russian gun at the Ukrainian head when the government was still weak. This was after Maidan, after Yanukovych led the country, as the new government was standing up, to give them time to do things like rebuild the army that Yanukovych had destroyed. They had to sign this stupid agreement. But that was, again, 7 years ago. And since then, 14,000 Ukrainians have died, 500,000 have trained to fight this war. It's not the same country, and they're not willing to accept these same terms of completely compromising their sovereignty, giving Russia like a permanent knife to their heart when that doesn't make any sense to them. And for them, what they keep trying to tell us is Minsk is the trap, not the solution to this problem. And we're all like, yeah, but if you just do Minsk, like then we can move forward and not fight this war. And they're like, no, Minsk is the thing that will topple the government in Ukraine. Like there is no political support domestically for all these concessions to the Russians after this long, painful war. If we do this, there will be uprisings in the street, right? And we're like, no, just agree to the thing. And they're like, no, we can't. And now Putin, of course, has come back after his meeting with Macron and just said, it is Minsk or die. Like, right. So they're really pushing on this.
So going back to your wager, like if you had to bet, you'd say, yes, he does it in the summer. We'll see what he does. Right. And maybe I can pull that apart a bit.
What they want, but what they want, and this is where the I don't know thing comes in, is what they want is the same thing they wanted in Georgia, which is for us, the West, particularly the Biden White House, to package Ukraine in nice paper and hand it to Russia in some sort of political agreement that Ukraine will not join the West in the way that it wants.
But what they also want
to placate you.
What Putin also wants, Molly, is disruption, right? And the idea, has Putin decided? I mean, Putin is looking at this in decades terms. The Chinese have a 1,000-year plan, and we have like a 6-month cycle based on congressional midterms, right? So if you look at Putin, he's poking at all areas, right? He's poking to see how tough is Germany going to be this time? How much can I push Biden? Where's France going to be? What is North Korea going to do? How are the Olympics? He's constantly rejiggering a strategy based off enemy contact, right? They always say no plan survives enemy contact. Putin is brilliant in that regard, and he's playing a long game. He plans to be there when he's 90 or 100. And if I were him, I would press Biden as much as I could, and I'd take a shot before the midterms when the Republicans take over Congress and will be a lot harder with me, right? And then maybe you've got 2 years from now with a President Trump, which could be totally different. So maybe he does a half measure sometime between now and likely our congressional elections when the opportunity is the softest and most disrupted and America's ripping itself apart with insurrections and mask mandates and everything. If I'm Putin, that looks like a pretty good time, right? It looks like a pretty good time to hit Biden when he's down and see how hard you can hit him. And then go back to the drawing board and wait for the next president and keep doing it over and over again. They seem to have a long view while we have a short view. And if I have to put a point on it, it's in part because they have continuity of leadership. When you've got Putin and he's the guy for decades, you can stick with his plan without interruption in a way we can't, because if Trump gets reelected, who the hell knows what our country is going to look like in 2 years. But it's pretty good. You can pretty much assume you know what Russia is going to look like as long as Putin's there.
Right. I'll disagree on one point, which is you're totally right. The Chinese have this 50-year planning horizon that's like extremely detailed, and there's metrics and they talk about it constantly, and they're constantly fulfilling the 5-year plan. But in 4 years, of course, always in 4 years. Russia is different. You're totally right in its stagnant / stable, pick either word you choose, leadership structure. These dudes have been there a long time now. It's all the same faces. It's like, oh, it's that guy again. Hello. It's all these guys from the Georgian War. It's all these guys from the first Ukraine War. It's just the same guys. But so that is true. But their planning horizon is really tomorrow. And it's like the way that some of my Estonian friends have explained it is it's like this prison mindset of you die today, maybe I die tomorrow, right? So it's like, we don't really care if this is actually a bad, stupid move for us, because everybody's like, why would they do this? It's a stupid thing for their economy and everything else, right? They don't actually care about that, because you might die today, and that's the goal, right? Is like, the goal is killing you today. And so I think there is this part of the reason we have such a bad ability to predict what the Kremlin is going to decide to do is there is this survival mentality that governs so much of this, combined with the love of fuckery. So it's like, well, let's just try it and see what happens, because we don't think there's going to be a cost, right? And if they did have the 20-year plan, they wouldn't be doing so much of this disruptive stuff. It's just that for now, because they don't have a vision of what 20 years from now looks like for Russia, right? They know what they want. They know how they feel. Like, they feel like they should be a great power, and they're not quite there, and they want to know why. But they're not. They don't really have a plan to achieve that, other than just fucking around all the time. That's why they keep doing it. And so I think you're right to say they will just keep looking for disruption opportunities anywhere, because that's the whole plan. But I think that this unpredictability in a totally illogical way for us is the thing that's so challenging. I think that's can't really make important. A prediction.
I think that's really important. That insight is really important, because America's always projecting our own constructs on everyone else, and that you identifying this as a survivor mentality. The prison yard, I'm going to shank you before you shank me, right? And even, love of fuckery is going in the subtitle of this episode, because that is so perfect and so true.
Is. Like, it's a joy that comes from planning fuckery.
It's geopolitical trolling, right? It's like, I'm going to fuck with you. And that might have to be, if we can get you to do your own podcast at some point, we might have to call it love of fuckery. But let me ask you, because this has been really, really valuable and insightful, and this is why I love having you on the show, because you pull this apart in ways that I don't hear anybody else doing it. And frankly, cable news and other places, even the PBSs and the NPRs, don't go deep enough. And I want to keep this show looking about, for me, strategy is about what else and what's next. And I want to think about what's next, but I also want to empower. I'm assuming most people who are listening to this show want to support Ukraine. Right?
Yeah.
And don't want Russia to steamroll across and create Red Dawn 2022. You're great about identifying the misinformation and disinformation part of this. And you posted something on Twitter today which basically said, don't retweet stupid shit without checking it out, because the Russians want that. Can you talk about what average person listening right now who's on social media, maybe not, living in Ukraine and what can an average American do, an average independent American do, to help support this in their own little way right now?
If you care about this and think that what Russia is doing is wrong, and think Ukraine has a point about getting to choose its own future and being a free country and et cetera, regardless what you think the United States should be doing. Should we be there? Should we be there more? Should we not be there? Should we give them stuff but not men? Like, whatever you actually think about this. And I understand there's a range of views on this, and I accept that. Don't create the information environment that achieves the opposite goal of Ukraine being able to stand up for itself. So, of course, we're all going to read the stupid Washington Post article about the 50,000 people dying in the first 4 seconds of the war. And I'm sure, honestly, that same assessment has been written about Washington if we get in a war with Russia. Like, well, all of Washington will die in the first 2 hours of the war, or whatever. Fine. Don't repost this panic mongering, Russia is so strong, look at all its tanks moving around, like, oh my God, we're weak and sad and Ukraine will never survive. Like, don't. You can read it if you want, but don't post it. Like, post the opposite of that, which is, we are helping them. There is some unity within the alliance. It is not enough, but there is mobilization in the right direction on that front in terms of what we should be doing to help Ukraine. But stop helping Putin look good and strong and mighty when it's so much smoke and mirrors, when there's no need to do that. And the story is much broader than that.
Can I hope you'll stick around for our Patreon members. I'm going to ask you about
Absolutely.
Your cat, and we'll talk some sci-fi for folks who are Patreon members. Exclusive content for you with Molly will be over there.
Always sci-fi.
Always sci-fi. But let me ask you a last question here, Molly, that I think is important. Every time we get into a conflict, it becomes a dehumanizing
Yeah.
affair. Can you tell people what do you love about Ukraine? What do you love about the Ukrainian people? Tell us what you think folks should know that they don't hear when they think of just, most folks think Ukrainians are Russians, Russians are Ukrainians. They're all like white dudes freezing, drinking vodka. Like, help us understand a bit about why you love Ukraine and what's to love about Ukraine.
And so much of the international media has been this white dude smoking vodka or whatever, just like
Yeah.
it's not always helpful. I think the thing about Ukraine that is so great is, well, it's a super diverse country in terms of what's going on there. There's a ton of really great old cultural sites and like things going on. Like there's a deep history in the country that's super fun. There's also a very young, vibrant culture in parts of the country. If you want to find hipsters, there's plenty of hipsters for you in Ukraine, which was surprising to me when I first went as well. But I think what I love is, despite the fact that there has been this perpetual state of war, I mean, really since late 2013, when the mobilization for the Maidan protests started, which was very planned and very deliberate in terms of how Ukrainian civil society was again looking to try to get Russian influence out of their society. That they have stuck with this, that during Afghanistan and all the stuff that you talked about in your many episodes covering this, with these incredible people that are working on the evacuations and other things, you constantly heard this crap from the White House that was like, well, the Afghans didn't fight hard enough for it, even though like all of these people died and like they're all, yeah, okay, didn't fight, but like in no way can you even begin to make the case that Ukraine didn't want it enough. They had a revolution to stand up for the ideals and values that they believed in, which is what we have. It's not more than that. It's not like they want special treatment. They just want us to leave the door open so they can get in there if they work hard enough to do it. They fought a revolution, won the revolution, rebuilt their country in a time of war, rebuilt their army in a time of war, did all of that with very little outside support while everyone told them not to. Just give in and make a deal with the Russians. It'll be easier for you. They didn't do that. I think it's easy for us over here to think of Ukraine in the same way that we think of Moldova or these other like little former Soviet republics. Ukraine is a real country. It has a huge industrial center. It is building its own weapons to fight this war because no one will sell them to them. They're forging these really great partnerships with the UK, with the Turks, with others to manufacture what they need there and do great technology exchanges. Like there's so much innovation happening in Ukraine in terms of how they have fought the kinetic war, what they have learned by fighting the war on electronic warfare, on cyber warfare, on physical warfare, that we are all there learning from them because they are fighting while we stand behind them.
Can I ask you one part of that?
Yeah,
I think that you've done a great job of painting that picture. And there's a unique fighting spirit to Ukraine, right? Anybody who's spent time there, who knows people, right? And let me ask you a specific question, because I had to look it up. Two of their most famous ambassadors for a long time were the Klitschko brothers. The heavyweight champion boxers. I remember being in the Lower East Side. I lived in a Ukrainian neighborhood, during many of the protests and orange ribbons everywhere and all of that, right? But Vladimir and Vitaly Klitschko, I think two of the most fascinating sports figures of our time.
So fascinating.
Is one of them still the mayor right now, right? He's the mayor of Kiev or something, right? I don't know if it's right. And they've said they're going to fight and die. I mean, there are these heroic figures that I don't feel like we see, and I invite either of the Klitschko brothers to come on this show anytime.
Or both.
Or both together. The one thing that disappointed me in all respect is that they wouldn't fight each other, because heavyweight boxing was such shit at the time. We all want, I know they're brothers. So true. But you pay me $100 million, I will beat the shit out of my brother, and he will understand, and we will.
It's the fight everybody wanted to see.
We will buy a Putin palace afterward. But I think I guess the question is, they are still there. They are. Yes. I hope we see more of them. But the Klitschko brothers, thoughts or insights?
I mean, look, with the mayor of Kiev brother, the problem with entering politics is once you enter politics, all the shit of politics gets on you, right? So there's the constant criticisms of, well, he's talking to this oligarch and that oligarch. Like, who knows? I don't know. That being said, Kiev at least has begun the kinds of emergency mobilizations that need to happen for Not because there might be a catastrophic invasion, but because if shit gets disrupted, you have to be able to survive, and there's a lot of people in Kiev. So I think there's helpful things happening. But the other brother, whatever the other brother is,
Vitaly
the
is
cuter
the one,
brother.
Vitaly is the one that's a mayor.
Right.
Vitaly is the one that's the mayor. I think Vladimir is the one that used to be married to Hayden Panettiere, right? And the Hollywood star from Heroes.
So yeah, that brother who was the better boxer and is the better looking one. Sorry, I didn't mean that. But he actually recently very publicly enlisted in the reserve forces to go do training. And I think again, just like knowing that mug there is the $200 million mug, and he's like, fuck this shit, I'm gonna go get ready to shoot Russians too. It's a hugely important signal in the country about what Ukrainians feel and think. Like, you keep hearing all this panicky stuff, oh God, if anything happens, there's going to be like zillions of Ukrainian refugees flooding across the borders. Like, of course there's going to be displacements and disruptions, but there's also going to be a lot of people who could choose to be somewhere else who are going to be there fighting because they think this is important. And I just think that it's a very important signal within the country of the commitment of people understanding what is at stake. And I agree with you on the Klitschko brothers. I would highly recommend, I think it's on HBO, or it was an HBO documentary, but the Klitschko brothers, it's like Klitschko documentary. It's a short thing, but there's some fascinating stuff in there, including about their inside the Soviet Union upbringing. Yeah. And the best vignette in there is when the cuter, better boxer brother is like, back at the now abandoned Soviet military base where they were children. Their father was a Soviet helicopter pilot who was part of that group of helicopters that had to go and dump shit on the reactor in Chernobyl to stop it from burning. So, all these guys would like fly, get zonked by radiation. And then these helicopters would come back, land, get disinfected, like hosed down, right? And the water from the thing would go into these two pools at this military base, and all the kids would go and play with their little paper boats at these like radioactive water pools. And there's this absolutely eerie story of the one Klitschko brother telling the story of now as a grown-up understanding they were all just like bathing in radiation for months on end, and you're like, well, maybe that's why you're 7 feet tall.
Exactly. Well, that's as the son of a man who worked at a nuke plant for many years, there was long in our area a question of why were the Rykov brothers so much bigger than their father and grandfather, and it was because Dad worked at Indian Point. So it was, I'm familiar with that. A little sprinkle
of radiation.
A little sprinkle. Yeah. But Molly McKew, you continue to be a guardian on the watchtower. You are tracking stuff that folks are not tracking, and you are among the most vigilant. We didn't get to talk about independent politics next time you come back because you've been working with Evan McMullen and others, and that's an important part of this.
Super important. Every conversation on foreign policy too.
Yeah, every conversation we have is not enough, so I hope you'll come back soon. In the meantime, everyone needs to follow Great Powers, follow you on Twitter, and Patreon members can stick around for a little bit more. But thank you for all you do. Thank you for keeping the watch, and we will pray for peace and prepare for war. And any other crazy shit, and lots of fuckery, because that is the word of the week, is fuckery.
It's always fuckery.
So thank you for that. Stay vigilant, my friend.